Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and like the video so you won't miss our true horror stories. The Appalachian Mountains are the kind of place where it feels like the words you speak just disappear into the air. During my first few nights, at Checkpoint Delta, I was trying to understand the heavy feeling pressing down on me and the strange silence. I'm Sergeant William Price, but everyone calls me Bill. I've been a soldier for 3 tours in Afghanistan, fighting hard battles in places where people couldn't even say the names. But in the winter of 2019, what happened in those mountains was too much for me to handle. We were a small team as the mission required. Just the 4 of us were running a checkpoint deep in a forest road that twisted through the wild areas of West Virginia, surrounded by trees. Our instructions said that our mission was part of a training exercise working with local police. It was mentioned that it had something to do with watching the paths used by drug smugglers in the mountains. The real reason we were there didn't matter to us because those were the orders we had received. My team had Corporal Luis Ramirez, our sharpshooter who could hit a needle from 800 yards away, Specialist Marcus Carter, whom everyone called Mac, handling the M249 saw, and Private Ethan Walker, fresh out of Fort Benning and excited to prove himself. Good men, all of them. Walker was just 20 years old and still had that excitement that hadn't been beaten out of him by war yet. The checkpoint itself wasn't much more than a strong guard shack and some concrete blocks arranged across the road. We had heat-sensing equipment, night vision, and enough weapons to stop anything except an armored vehicle. The forest pressed in on both sides, with ancient trees that had probably been standing since before the Civil War. During the day, it was beautiful country. At night, it became something else entirely. Our shifts ran 12 hours on, 12 hours off, with 2 men always on duty while the others rested at a small base about 5 miles down the mountain. The first week passed without anything happening. We checked the occasional pickup truck, mostly local people who knew about the checkpoint and were okay with it. Some of them would even bring us coffee or homemade sandwiches, thankful for what they thought was protection from the drug makers who sometimes set up in the deep woods. It was on our 8th night that things started to go wrong. Ramirez and I had the midnight shift, and the temperature had dropped way below freezing. Ice crystals formed on everything metal, and our breath came out in thick clouds that hung in the still air. We were about 2 hours into our shift when Ramirez grabbed my arm. "You hear that, Sarge?" he whispered, tilting his head to one side. I listened, pushing my ears against the silence. At first, I heard nothing except the occasional crack of ice forming on tree branches. Then I caught it, a sound like someone knocking on wood, steady and rhythmic. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. "Probably just a woodpecker," I said, though I knew no woodpecker would be active at 2 o'clock in the morning in freezing temperatures. Ramirez shook his head. "That's no bird, man. Listen to the pattern." He was right. The knocking had a purposeful quality to it, almost like Morse code. It would come from one direction, stop, then start up from somewhere else, always keeping that same rhythm. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. I picked up the radio to call it in to base, but all I got was static. That wasn't unusual. The mountains messed with communications, but the timing made me nervous. I tried again, adjusting the frequency slightly. Still nothing but white noise. "Thermal's picking up something," Ramirez said, his eye pressed to the scope mounted on his rifle. "About 200 meters out, moving between the trees." I grabbed the portable heat imager and scanned the tree line. There it was, a heat shape much larger than a deer, moving with purpose through the forest alongside our position. It would appear briefly between trees, then vanish, only to reappear 30 or 40 feet away. Whatever it was big and it was watching us. "Could be a bear," I suggested, though the movement pattern was all wrong for a bear. Bears lumber. This thing was moving with an almost military-like precision, using the trees for cover. "Since when do bears knock on trees?" Ramirez countered. He had a point. I kept the thermal trained on the forest, tracking the heat shape as it circled our position. It never came closer than about 150 meters, always staying just at the edge of our shooting range. After about 20 minutes, it simply vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, as if it had simply melted into the cold mountain air. The knocking stopped, too. The forest returned to its normal night sounds, the whisper of wind through bare branches, the distant call of an owl. We stayed on high alert for the rest of our shift, but nothing else happened. When Carter and Walker arrived to relieve us at 6 a.m., we told them what we'd seen. "Probably just some hillbilly messing with us," Carter said, though he checked his weapon with more care than usual. These mountain folk got a weird sense of humor. Walker, young and eager, seemed almost excited by the chance of something unusual happening. "Maybe it's Bigfoot," he said with a grin. "My granddad used to tell stories about seeing something in these mountains when he was young." We all laughed it off, but I noticed Ramirez didn't join in. He'd grown up in New Mexico near the reservation lands and had told me once that his grandmother believed in things that walked between worlds. Usually, he was the first to crack a joke about anything supernatural, but not this time. The next night was my off-rotation, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that heat shape, the way it had moved through the trees with such clear purpose. Around 3 a.m., my radio crackled to life. It was Walker, and he sounded scared. "Sarge, we need you up here. Something's wrong." I was already pulling on my boots when he continued. "It's all around us, Sarge. The knocking. It's coming from every direction." I grabbed my gear and rushed up the mountain road, the headlights of my Humvee cutting through the darkness. As I got close to the checkpoint, I could hear it even through the vehicle's armor. That rhythmic knocking, but now it seemed to be coming from dozens of sources surrounding the position. Carter was on the M249, moving it slowly back and forth across the tree line. Walker stood with his back to the guard shack, his rifle at the ready, but his hands shaking visibly. The temperature had dropped even further than the night before, and ice fog had rolled in, reducing how far we could see to maybe 50 meters. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, taking position beside them. "About an hour," Carter replied. "Started with just one, then more joined in. Thermals showing multiple shapes, but they're weird. They keep appearing and disappearing." I looked through the thermal sight myself and immediately saw what he meant. Heat shapes would bloom into existence, move a short distance, then simply vanish. Not like they were moving behind cover, but like they were literally disappearing. And there were a lot of them, at least a dozen, maybe more, forming a rough circle around our position. "We tried calling base," Walker said. "Radio's completely dead. Even the emergency frequency is just static." That's when the smell hit us. It rolled in with the fog. A thick musky odor like wet dog mixed with something else. Something rotten. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Walker actually gagged, turning away to spit. "Jesus Christ," Carter muttered. "What is that?" Before I could answer, one of the concrete barriers shifted. Not much, maybe an inch or two, but these things weighed over 1,000 pounds each. We all heard it, the grinding scrape of concrete on road surface. "Did that just—" Walker started to ask, but his question was cut off by a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't quite a roar and wasn't quite a scream. It was something between the two, so loud and so deep that I felt it in my chest. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the mountains and multiplying until it sounded like a chorus of nightmares. Every instinct I had from 3 combat tours was screaming at me to open fire, to do something, but there was no target, just shadows and fog and that terrible sound. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The knocking stopped. The smell faded. The forest fell silent except for our own ragged breathing. We stood there, weapons raised, looking for threats that never showed up. "Sarge," Walker whispered, and I turned to look at him. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He was pointing at the concrete barrier that had moved. There, pressed deep into the concrete as if it were soft clay, were 5 marks. They looked like claw marks, each one nearly 2 inches deep, spaced apart in a pattern that looked like a hand. But a hand that would have to be nearly 18 inches across. We stayed at full alert until dawn, but nothing else happened that night. When the sun finally came up and burned away the fog, we could see the forest clearly again. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But those claw marks remained, a physical reminder that something had been there, something strong enough to cut into concrete like butter. I called in the incident as soon as communications were restored, but the response from command was predictable. investigate and report. Stay in position. Do not fight unless directly threatened. They probably thought we were spooked by bears or our imagination. They hadn't heard that sound. They hadn't smelled that odor. They hadn't seen concrete barriers moved by something unseen. Ramirez arrived with our relief shift, took one look at the claw marks, and crossed himself. "We need to get out of here, Sarge," he said quietly. "This is bad medicine." But we couldn't leave. We had orders. And so we stayed, even as I felt in my bones that we were being watched, studied, tested by something that had decided we were intruding on its territory. That was day 9. We had 5 more days scheduled at Checkpoint Delta. Looking back now, I wish we'd left that morning. I wish we'd thrown our careers away and just driven down that mountain. Because what happened over those next 5 days would change everything I thought I knew about the world and cost us more than any of us were prepared to pay. Walker was the first to go missing. And when it happened, we all knew our deaths were stalking us through those ancient trees. The morning after the claw mark incident, I made the decision to keep all 4 of us at the checkpoint instead of rotating shifts. Command wasn't happy about it, but they weren't the ones staring at concrete that had been cut like soft cheese. We set up a proper defensive position, bringing up additional supplies from the base and stringing motion sensors along the tree line. Walker seemed to take comfort in the busy work. He helped Carter set up overlapping fields of fire while Ramirez and I installed infrared cameras at key points around our area. By afternoon, we had turned our simple checkpoint into something resembling a combat outpost. It should have made us feel safer. Didn't. "You know what gets me?" Carter said as we sat down to our meals that evening. "The way those heat shapes just vanished. I've used thermal imaging in Iraq, Afghanistan, stateside training. Heat doesn't just disappear like that. Unless whatever we're looking at can control its body temperature," Ramirez suggested. "Some animals can do that. Certain snakes, some deep-sea fish." "Yeah, but we're not in the ocean, and snakes don't leave claw marks in concrete," I pointed out. Walker had been quiet through most of the meal, pushing his food around more than eating it. Finally, he spoke up. "My granddad, the one I mentioned, he was a coal miner here in West Virginia back in the 60s. He told me once that they broke through into a natural cave system while following a coal seam. Said they found bones in there, big bones arranged in patterns. Company sealed it up the next day, told them never to speak about it." "Come on, Walker," Carter scoffed. "Every mountain town has stories like that." "Maybe," Walker admitted. But he also said that after they sealed that cave, miners started disappearing. 1 or 2 at first, always on night shifts. They'd just vanish. No cave-ins, no accidents, just gone. Mining company eventually shut down that whole section. Claimed it was unstable. I was about to tell Walker to focus on the job at hand when my radio crackled. It was the base commander, Colonel Harrison. "Sergeant Price, we're sending you some additional support. Should arrive within the hour." My relief must have been clear. "Thank you, sir." "How many men?" "It's not soldiers, Sergeant. We've brought in a specialist. Someone with experience in unusual wildlife situations." Before I could ask what that meant, the connection cut out. An hour later, a beat-up Forest Service truck rolled up to our checkpoint. The woman who stepped out couldn't have been more than 45, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. She wore civilian hiking gear but moved with a confidence that suggested military or law enforcement background. "Sergeant Price, I'm Dr. Sarah Whitaker," she said, extending a hand. "I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in cryptozoology." Carter actually laughed. "They sent us a Bigfoot hunter?" Dr. Whitaker's expression didn't change. "I prefer the term undocumented species researcher. And yes, that's exactly what they sent you." She walked over to examine the claw marks in the concrete, pulling out a small camera to photograph them from multiple angles. "How many individuals have you observed?" "We're not even sure what we observed," I said carefully. "Thermal shapes that appear and disappear, knocking sounds and patterns, a musky odor strong enough to cause physical distress, and enough strength to mark concrete like this." She stood up, looking directly at me. "You've encountered a troop of what locals call the old men of the mountain. I've been tracking reports of them for 15 years. You're talking about Sasquatch, Ramirez said. It wasn't a question. I'm talking about a remaining population of primates that have been living in these mountains since before humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge, Dr. Whitaker replied. They're intelligent, highly territorial, and generally avoid human contact. The fact that they're actively engaging with your position is unusual. Unusual how? I asked. They typically give human settlements a wide berth. Something about your presence here has provoked them. Have you done anything that might be seen as aggressive? Fired weapons? Cut down trees? Disturbed any cave systems? We all shook our heads. We've just been manning the checkpoint, I said. Nothing else. Dr. Whitaker frowned. Then something else has changed in their territory, something that's made them view you as a threat, or, she paused, seeming to consider her words carefully, or they're trying to warn you about something. That night, Dr. Whitaker stayed with us at the checkpoint. She'd brought equipment I'd never seen before. Acoustic recording devices, scent detectors, and what she called a wood knock box that could copy the knocking sounds we'd been hearing. Don't use that, I said when she pulled it out. We don't want to provoke them. On the contrary, she said, communication might be exactly what we need. Around 11 p.m., the knocking started again. This time, Dr. Whitaker was ready with her recording equipment. The pattern was more complex than before, not just the repetitive three-knock sequence, but variations, almost like a conversation between multiple individuals. They're discussing something, she said, listening through headphones. This is organized communication, not random territorial displays. Walker was on the thermal scope. I've got movement, multiple shapes approaching from the north. We all took defensive positions, but Dr. Whitaker remained standing, studying her equipment. Wait, she said. Don't show aggression. Let me try something. Before I could stop her, she picked up her wood knock box and responded to the pattern. 3 knocks, then 2, then 3 again. The forest fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then came a response, a single powerful knock that seemed to shake the ground beneath our feet. Dr. Whitaker's face went pale. That's not good. That's a warning. A final warning. Warning about what? I demanded. To leave. Now. That's when Walker screamed. I turned to see him being dragged backward, his rifle falling from his hands. Something had him, something massive and covered in dark fur. In the split second I saw it clearly. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with arms that seemed too long for its body and a face that was almost human but wrong in every way that mattered. We opened fire. The night erupted with muzzle flashes and the roar of Carter's M249. The creature dropped Walker and vanished into the darkness faster than anything that size should be able to move. Walker scrambled back to us, his uniform torn, his face white with terror. It spoke, he gasped. When it had me, it spoke. Not English, but words. It was trying to tell me something. Dr. Whitaker was already examining him, checking for injuries. Miraculously, aside from some bruises and torn clothing, he seemed unharmed. They don't usually make physical contact, she said. This is getting worse beyond anything in my research. I made the command decision then. We're pulling back to the base now. Nobody argued. We loaded into our vehicles, leaving the checkpoint equipment behind. As we drove down the mountain road, I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see something chasing us. But there was nothing, just darkness and the sense that we were being allowed to leave. At the base, I immediately contacted Colonel Harrison and gave him a full report, with Dr. Whitaker backing up everything I said. I expected disbelief, maybe even punishment. Instead, he said something that chilled me to the bone. We've had 2 other checkpoints report similar encounters in the last 48 hours. Whatever's happening out there, it's not limited to your position. Dr. Whitaker pulled me aside after the call. Sergeant, I need to be honest with you. In all my years of research, I've never seen them act this aggressively. Something has driven them from their normal territory. Something that scared them enough to risk contact with armed humans. Scared them? They're 8 feet tall and can apparently appear and disappear at will. What could scare them? She looked back toward the dark mountains. That's what worries me, because if something has made top predators flee their territory. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We spent the rest of the night making the base stronger, but nothing came. Dawn brought new orders from command. We were to return to the checkpoint with a full squad, secure the area, and continue operations. They were sending additional personnel, including what Harrison called specialists in unusual wildlife. Walker pulled me aside as we prepared to head back up the mountain. "Sarge, I don't think I can do this." What that thing said to me, I didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. It was trying to warn us. There's something else out there. Something worse. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was just his fear talking. But I'd seen the terror in that creature's eyes. Yes, terror when it had grabbed Walker. It wasn't hunting. It was desperate. "Stay close to the squad," I told him. "We'll get through this." But I was wrong. Within 12 hours of returning to Checkpoint Delta, Walker would be gone, and we'd learned that the massive creatures we'd been encountering were running from something that should not exist, something that had been sleeping in the deep places of the mountains until we'd awakened it with our presence. The old men of the mountain weren't our enemy. They were trying to be our warning. The squad that joined us at Checkpoint Delta brought our numbers to 12 men, plus Dr. Whitaker and 2 other specialists. A geologist named Dr. Marcus Webb and a man who introduced himself only as Thompson and refused to say more about his background. Thompson wore no rank insignia, carried communication equipment I didn't recognize, and had the kind of blank expression that suggested he'd seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. We rebuilt the checkpoint by noon, but the forest felt different in daylight, oppressive. The trees seemed to lean in closer, and even birds avoided the area. The claw marks in the concrete had somehow gotten deeper overnight, as if something had returned to refresh its warning. Dr. Webb immediately began taking soil samples and running some kind of ground-penetrating radar sweeps. "There's definitely something unusual about the geology here," he reported. "I'm reading cave systems that aren't on any maps, big ones. They seem to come together about 300 meters northeast of your position. That's where the thermal shapes kept appearing and disappearing," Ramirez noted. Thompson had been silent most of the morning, but now he spoke up. "We need to investigate those caves." "Like hell we do," Carter said. "You want to follow those things into their own territory?" "They're not using the caves as shelter," Dr. Whitaker said, studying the tracks she'd found near the tree line. "These patterns suggest they're avoiding that area entirely. Whatever's in those caves, even they won't go near it." Walker had been jumpy all morning, constantly checking over his shoulder. I tried to keep him close, but he insisted on manning the thermal imaging station. He said it made him feel better to see what was coming. That was our first mistake. Around 2 p.m., Walker reported movement on the thermal scope. Single shape approaching from the northeast. Strange. The heat patterns all wrong. I looked through the scope and immediately understood what he meant. Normal living creatures show heat distribution patterns, warmer at the core, cooler at the limbs. This thing was evenly hot, almost glowing on the thermal, and it moved wrong. It didn't walk so much as flow, its limbs seeming to stretch and shrink in ways that hurt to watch. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered. Dr. Whitaker had gone very still. "That's not one of the old men." The thing stopped about 100 meters out, just at the edge of the forest. Through the scope, I could see it more clearly, and I wished I couldn't. It was roughly human-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with skin that seemed to ripple and shift like liquid. Its face, if you could call it a face, was a smooth surface broken only by 2 deep holes where eyes should be. "Nobody move," Thompson said quietly. He'd pulled out one of his strange devices, pointing it at the creature. "It's scanning us." For 5 minutes, nobody breathed. The thing stood perfectly still, that even heat shape never changing. Then, without warning, it simply sank into the ground. Not like it was digging. It just went straight down as if the earth had turned liquid beneath it. "Underground," Dr. Webb breathed. "It went underground." That's when Walker broke. He dropped the thermal scope and ran. Not away from the checkpoint, but toward the vehicles. "I'm not staying here," he shouted. "They tried to warn us. We should have listened. I called after him, but he was already at the Humvee. He grabbed the keys from the ignition, we'd left them there for a quick evacuation, and started the engine. The last thing I saw was his terrified face through the windshield as he drove away down the mountain road. I tried to reach him on the radio, but got only static. 10 minutes later, we heard the crash. The sound echoed up the mountain. Metal on stone, glass breaking, then silence. I took Ramirez and 2 others to investigate. We found the Humvee about a mile down the road, wrapped around a massive oak tree. The driver's door was open, the seatbelt cut cleanly through. There was blood on the steering wheel and more on the ground leading into the forest, but Walker was gone. The seatbelt's been cut from the outside, Ramirez observed. Someone pulled him out. We followed the blood trail for about 50 meters before it simply stopped. No body, no signs of struggle, just an end to the trail as if Walker had been lifted straight up or down. When we returned to the checkpoint, Thompson was in heated discussion with someone on his satellite phone. I caught fragments, containment protocol, and sterilization options. Dr. Whitaker pulled me aside. "We need to leave, Sergeant. Now, that thing Walker saw, I've seen references to it in local folklore. The indigenous peoples who lived here before European settlement had names for it. The earth swimmers, the things below. They believed certain places were cursed, where the barrier between our world and somewhere else was thin. You're talking about beings from other dimensions now." I couldn't keep the doubt out of my voice. "I'm talking about something that existed before human understanding," she replied. "The old men of the mountain have lived here for thousands of years. If they're running from these things, we should, too." But Thompson had other ideas. That night, he announced we were going to investigate the problem. He'd received permission from someone well above Colonel Harrison's level. We were to enter the cave system Dr. Webb had identified and figure out the nature of the threat. I protested. We'd already lost Walker. But Thompson produced orders that superseded my command. We would go in at first light. That night, the old men returned, not aggressively this time, but almost begging. They surrounded our position, knocking in complex patterns that Dr. Whitaker tried desperately to decode. Around 2 a.m., one of them approached close enough for us to see it clearly in the spotlights. It was massive, covered in dark brown fur with streaks of gray. Its face was almost human in its expressiveness, and the look in its eyes was one of deep sadness. It raised one huge hand and pointed toward the caves, then drew it across its throat in a gesture that needed no translation. "It's warning us," Dr. Whitaker whispered. "They're trying to save us." The creature then did something I'll never forget. It spoke, not in growls or grunts, but in broken, halting English. The words were barely recognizable, forced through a throat never meant for human speech. But the message was clear. "Do not wake them." Then it turned and vanished. Into the forest. The others followed, and within minutes we were alone again. The silence that followed was somehow worse than any amount of knocking or screaming. Thompson was unfazed. "Fascinating. They've learned basic human language. This will need to be documented." "Didn't you hear what it said?" Carter demanded. "It told us not to wake them. Whatever's in those caves has been sleeping, and we're about to wake it up." "Primitive superstition," Thompson replied. "We have a job to do." At dawn, we entered the caves. The entrance was hidden behind a fall of rocks that looked natural, but Dr. Webb insisted had been placed on purpose. Inside, the temperature dropped 20 degrees immediately. Our breath came out in clouds, and ice covered the walls despite it being early autumn. The cave system was huge. Our lights seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, and every sound echoed strangely, coming back distorted. We followed the main passage for about 200 meters before it opened into a massive chamber. What we found there couldn't be explained. The walls were covered in symbols, not carved, but somehow grown into the rock itself, as if the stone had been convinced to form these shapes. They hurt to look at directly, seeming to shift and squirm when caught in the corner of your vision. In the center of the chamber was a pit, perfectly circular, about 30 feet across. The edges were smooth as glass. Dr. Webb took readings. "This is impossible. The rock here dates to different geological periods. It's like someone took pieces from across millions of years and put them together here. Thompson was setting up his equipment around the pit. There's an energy reading coming from below. Something's definitely down there. That's when we heard it. A sound from deep in the pit, like breathing, but wrong. Too big, too slow, as if something massive was stirring in its sleep. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and frost began forming on our gear. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." But it was too late. The breathing sound grew louder, and something began to rise from the pit. Not quickly, but with the slow inevitability of a nightmare becoming real. First came the heat shape on our thermals. Not hot like the thing Walker had seen, but cold. So cold it registered as a void. Then came the physical presence, and my mind simply refused to process what I was seeing. It wasn't one thing, but many, all wound together in a mass that shouldn't exist. Limbs that bent in too many places. Faces that formed and melted away. Eyes that opened in places eyes should never be. It rose from the pit like smoke, but solid, but liquid, but something else entirely. Carter opened fire first, his training overriding his terror. The bullets passed through it without effect. Then it noticed us. The thing that came up from the pit moved toward us with a terrible purpose. Not fast, but unstoppable, like a tide of wrongness flowing across the cave floor. Where it touched the stone, the rock changed, becoming something that hurt to look at. Not quite solid, not quite liquid, existing in a state that human eyes weren't meant to process. "Fall back," I shouted, but my voice sounded muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. Thompson was the only one not retreating. He stood frozen, his equipment recording everything. "Incredible," he muttered. "The energy readings are off the scale. It's not from our dimension at all. It's pushing through from somewhere else." The thing reached him first. It didn't attack so much as surround him. Thompson's scream cut off suddenly as his body began to change. His flesh rippling and restructuring into shapes that shouldn't exist. Within seconds, he wasn't Thompson anymore, but part of the mass, his consciousness seemingly absorbed into the collective wrongness of the creature. That broke our freeze. We ran. The passage back seemed longer, darker. Our lights flickered and failed one by one. Behind us came the sound of pursuit. Not footsteps, but a wet sliding noise accompanied by that terrible breathing. The walls themselves began to change, the solid rock becoming soft, pulsing like living tissue. Ramirez was right behind me when the floor gave way beneath him. Not a cave-in. The stone simply became permeable, and he sank into it up to his waist. I grabbed his arms, trying to pull him free, but the rock was hardening again, trapping him. "Go!" he shouted. "Get out and seal it." I wanted to stay, to fight for him, but Carter was dragging me backward. Behind Ramirez, the thing was approaching, filling the tunnel like water finding its level. Ramirez pulled the pins on his grenades, gave me one last nod, and I ran. The explosion shook the entire mountain. Rocks fell from the ceiling, and for a moment, I thought we'd all be buried. But we kept running, the remaining 6 of us, driven by pure survival instinct. We burst from the cave entrance into blinding daylight. Dr. Whitaker was already on the radio, screaming for immediate evacuation. Dr. Webb was backing toward the vehicles, his face pale with shock. "The readings. The whole mountain is becoming unstable. Whatever that thing is, it's spreading through the rock structure itself." That's when the old men of the mountain appeared. They emerged from the forest in numbers I couldn't count. Dozens, maybe more. But they weren't approaching us. They were forming a line between us and the cave, facing the entrance with grim determination. The largest one, the one that had spoken to us, looked back at me once. There was no anger in its eyes now, only acceptance. They began to vocalize, not screaming or roaring, but a deep harmonious sound that seemed to resonate with the mountain itself. The ground beneath our feet began to vibrate in response. Dr. Whitaker grabbed my arm. "They're going to seal it," she said. "They're going to bring down the whole mountainside to contain that thing. We need to move now." We ran for the vehicles as the mountain began to shake violently. Behind us, I could hear the old men's vocalization growing stronger, more complex, almost like a chant or prayer. The cave entrance began to collapse, but not from the explosion. The rocks were flowing together, melding into a solid barrier. We made it to the vehicles just as the first major collapse began. As we drove down the mountain road, I looked back to see an impossible sight. The entire upper section of the mountain was falling in on itself, but in a controlled way, layer after layer compressing down. The old men stood their ground until the very end, their voices never wavering, even as the avalanche consumed them. They sacrificed themselves to seal that thing inside. The official report would say that a local earthquake caused a landslide that killed several soldiers and civilian contractors. Walker was listed as missing, presumed dead. Ramirez got a hero's burial with full honors. The families were told it was a training accident. Dr. Whitaker and I were questioned for 3 days straight by people whose names I was never told. They made it clear that speaking about what really happened would be considered treason at best. Dr. Webb had a breakdown and, last I heard, was in a psychiatric facility, drawing those symbols over and over on any surface he could find. Carter left the military 6 months later, moved to Florida, about as far from mountains as he could get. Max sends me a Christmas card every year, but we never talk about what happened. The other survivors scattered to different places, each carrying their piece of the nightmare. But I stayed in the service. Someone has to remember. Someone has to watch. Because here's what keeps me up at night. We found evidence in that cave of other sites, other places where these things had broken through before. The symbols on the walls weren't warnings. They were a map. There are more of them sleeping in the deep places of the world, waiting for something to wake them. The old men of the mountain knew this. They'd been guardians, keeping watch, keeping the things below from rising. And now they're gone, at least from that part of the Appalachians. We destroyed the only thing standing between us and them. Sometimes I drive back to West Virginia. The mountain we collapsed has been declared unstable, off-limits to civilians. But I've seen the government teams that go in periodically, taking readings, checking sensors. They're watching for any sign that the seal is breaking. Last month, I got a call from Dr. Whitaker. She'd been tracking reports from other mountain ranges. The Rockies, the Andes, even the Alps, stories of large hairy creatures fleeing their traditional territories, of underground sounds that shouldn't exist, of people disappearing near cave systems that weren't on any maps. They're waking up, she told me. All over the world. They're waking up. I asked her what we could do. Learn, she said. The old men of the mountain knew how to keep them contained. There might be others who still remember. We need to find them before it's too late. So that's what I do now. I travel to remote places, talk to indigenous peoples, collect stories that most would dismiss as folklore. I'm looking for the ones who still guard the deep places, who still remember why certain caves should never be entered, why some mountains should never be climbed. Because Walker was right. The old men weren't the monsters in those mountains. They were trying to warn us about what slept below. And we didn't listen until it was too late. Every night I dream about that pit in the cave, about the thing that rose from it. I dream about Thompson's face as he was absorbed, about Ramirez sinking into solid stone. But mostly I dream about the old man who spoke to us, who tried so hard to make us understand. Do not wake them, he'd said. We should have listened. The Appalachian Mountains are beautiful from a distance, the ancient peaks covered in forest, the morning mist rising from the valleys. Tourists drive through taking pictures. Hikers walk the trails. And life goes on as if nothing happened. But I know the truth. Beneath those mountains, contained for now by a sacrifice we barely understand, something waits. And one day the seal will break. When that happens, when the things below finally rise, I wonder if humanity will understand what we lost when we drove away the old men of the mountain. They were never our enemy. They were our last line of defense against something far worse than any nightmare we could imagine. I still have the photos from that night at Checkpoint Delta, the claw marks in concrete, the thermal images of shapes that shouldn't exist. I keep them as a reminder of the night we learned that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some doors are meant to stay closed, and some warnings should never be ignored. The Forest Service has a saying, leave only footprints, take only pictures. But we left more than footprints in those mountains. We left a wound that may never heal. And we took something that can never be returned. The guardians who stood between us and the dark. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, I swear I can still hear them knocking in the distance. A rhythm that speaks of ancient knowledge and terrible secrets. 3 knocks, then silence. A warning that echoes through time, reminding us that we are not alone and that some things are better left sleeping in the deep places of the world. The old men of the mountain are gone, but their warning remains. Do not wake them. We should have listened. We really should have listened. 6 months after the incident at Checkpoint Delta, I was called to a meeting at Fort Bragg. Not a questioning this time. Those had ended weeks ago. This was different. The room was small, windowless, and contained only 3 people. Myself, Dr. Whitaker, and a man in a suit who introduced himself as Director Harrison. No first name, no agency name, just Director Harrison. Sergeant Price, he began, sliding a folder across the table. What I'm about to show you is classified beyond any level you've previously seen. The decision to let you in was not made lightly. I opened the folder. Inside were photographs from around the world. Cave entrances in Tibet, massive footprints in the Amazon, and thermal imaging from the Ural Mountains that looked disturbingly familiar. Each image was labeled with dates going back decades. Checkpoint Delta was not a one-time incident, Harrison continued. We've been tracking these events since 1952, when a mining operation in Alaska broke through into what they described as an impossible cavern. 12 men went missing. The survivors reported encounters with both the large primates you encountered and the other things. Dr. Whitaker leaned forward. The organization Director Harrison represents has been monitoring and, when possible, protecting the remaining populations of what you call the old men of the mountain. We now know they exist on every continent except Antarctica. They're the guardians, Sergeant. They've been keeping those things contained for longer than human civilization has existed. I studied the photos, noting the patterns. You knew what we'd find at Checkpoint Delta. Harrison's expression didn't change. We suspected. The earthquake activity in the region suggested something was stirring underground. We needed military assets in place in case of a breach. You used us as bait. We used you as an early warning system, he corrected. And it worked. The breach was contained with minimal casualties. Minimal casualties? I stood up, anger flashing through me. I lost good men. Those creatures, the old men, they all died too. Clean up your mess. Sit down, Sergeant. Harrison's voice was calm, but carried an edge of authority that made me comply despite myself. You're right to be angry, but anger won't help us deal with what's coming. The old men of the mountain, as Dr. Whitaker calls them, are dying out. Not from hunting or habitat loss, but from something else. They're being driven from their traditional territories by increased activity from below. Dr. Whitaker pulled out a tablet, showing me a map with red dots scattered across it. These are confirmed breach sites from the last 5 years. Notice the pattern. The dots were increasing in frequency, clustering around major mountain ranges, but also appearing in places I wouldn't have expected. Urban areas, desert regions, even underwater locations marked off the coast. It's speeding up, I said. Yes, Harrison confirmed. We believe something has changed in their dimension, if we can call it that. Something that's driving them to push through into our world with increasing desperation. What do you want from me? Harrison and Whitaker exchanged glances. We're forming a specialized unit, Harrison said. Military personnel who've had direct contact with these entities and survived. People who understand the threat and won't freeze when faced with something that shouldn't exist. We need you to lead one of the response teams. I thought about Carter struggling with nightmares in Florida, about Ramirez's widow who still didn't know how her husband really died, about Walker, whose body was never found. What would this involve? Training others to recognize the signs of an upcoming breach, developing protocols for containment, and when necessary, direct intervention. You want me to fight those things? The weapons we had were useless. Dr. Whitaker shook her head. Not fight. Communicate. The old men of the mountain have been trying to teach us their containment methods. Some indigenous peoples still remember fragments of the old ways. We need to piece together this knowledge before it's too late. Harrison stood up. Take some time to think about it, Sergeant, but not too long. We've detected earthquake problems in 3 new locations. Whatever's happening down there, it's spreading. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the old man who'd spoken to us, who'd tried so hard to warn us. They'd given their lives to stop one breach. How many more could they stop before their numbers ran out entirely? 3 days later, I accepted Harrison's offer. My first assignment was in Montana, where a Blackfoot elder claimed his grandfather had left instructions for when the earth becomes soft. The knowledge was incomplete, passed down through generations and corrupted by time, but it was a start. The elder, a man named Joseph Crowfeather, looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. My grandfather said the hairy giants were our older brothers, he told me. They stood watch at the thin places where the world below touches ours. He said there would come a time when they would need our help, when the old barriers would weaken. Did he say how to strengthen them? Joseph shook his head. That knowledge was lost. But he did say this: the things below fear harmony. They exist in chaos, in spaces between spaces. Order, pattern, rhythm, these things can hold them back. It wasn't much, but it was more than we'd had before. I thought about the old men's vocalizations, the way they'd seemed to resonate with the mountain itself. Maybe there was something to it. Over the next year, I traveled the world, gathering fragments of knowledge. A village in Nepal where the locals performed ritual chants every full moon to keep the mountain sleeping. A cave system in Peru that indigenous peoples had sealed with intricately patterned stones that seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made my teeth ache. A remote island in Indonesia where the few remaining inhabitants told stories of the singers who walked tall, who had once kept the deep places quiet. Slowly, patterns emerged. The old men of the mountain weren't just physically preventing breaches. They were maintaining some kind of harmonic barrier, using vocalizations and resonance to reinforce the boundaries between dimensions. It was science so advanced it looked like magic, or perhaps magic so consistent it could be studied like science. But we were running out of time. The breaches were becoming more frequent. A shopping mall in Ohio had to be evacuated when the basement floor turned permeable. A subway tunnel in London experienced what authorities called a structural problem, but which I recognized from the security footage as an attempted breach. Each time we managed to contain it, but barely. Dr. Whitaker developed a device that could copy some of the harmonic frequencies we documented, but it was crude, power-intensive, and had a range of only about 50 meters. It's like trying to hold back the ocean with a screen door, she said after our first field test. Then came the news from Washington State. Mount Rainier was experiencing unusual earthquake activity. The pattern matched what we'd seen before Checkpoint Delta. But this was worse. Mount Rainier sat above a massive cave system, and if something broke through there, we'd have no way to contain it. The mountain was too big, too populated. Seattle was less than 60 miles away. Harrison assembled every response team for the biggest operation we'd attempted. 48 personnel, millions of dollars in equipment, and the cooperation of multiple agencies who still didn't fully understand what they were dealing with. We established a boundary around the most likely breach point, set up Dr. Whitaker's harmonic generators, and waited. On the third night, they came. Not the things from below, the old men of the mountain. More than I'd ever seen in one place, emerging from forests we'd thought were empty. They were different from the ones we'd encountered in West Virginia. Grayer, older-looking, moving with obvious difficulty. These were the last of their kind in this region, and they looked exhausted. The largest one approached our position. It was ancient, its fur completely white, its movements slow but deliberate. When it spoke, the words were clearer than any I'd heard from them before, as if it had been practicing for this moment. "You must learn," it said, each word a struggle. "We few now. You must learn." Dr. Whitaker stepped forward with a recording device. "Teach us, please." What followed was the most surreal night of my life. The old men began to vocalize, their harmonies complex and layered, and Whitaker's equipment recorded everything. But more than that, they showed us. Using gestures and simple demonstrations, They taught us the patterns, the rhythms, the specific frequencies that could reinforce the barriers. As dawn approached, the earthquake activity increased dramatically. The ground beneath us began to ripple. The old men immediately shifted their vocalizations, and we did our best to follow along, our harmonic generators adding their mechanical voices to the organic ones. I felt it more than heard it, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Reality grew thin in places, and through those thin spots, I could see things trying to push through, the same wrongness we'd encountered in the cave, but multiplied 100-fold. The old men's leader looked at me, its ancient eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Understanding, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. It placed one massive hand on my shoulder, gentle despite its size. "Now you know," it said, then louder to all its kind, a single resonant call that echoed across the mountain. They walked directly toward the breach points, still singing, their voices growing stronger with each step. The things trying to push through pulled back from them, but the old men didn't stop. They walked into the thin places, into the spaces between worlds, pulling the barriers closed behind them with their presence, their songs, their sacrifice. The last thing I saw was the ancient leader looking back one final time. It nodded, a gesture so human it made my chest tight, and then stepped through, sealing the breach with its passing. The ground solidified. The earthquake activity stopped. Mount Rainier fell silent. We never saw the old men of the mountain again. It's been 5 years since Mount Rainier. 5 years since the last confirmed sighting of the old men of the mountain. We still use their name, though we know now they called themselves something else, a vocalization too complex for human throats to reproduce. Dr. Whitaker's best approximation sounds like singing wind through ancient trees, but even that doesn't do it justice. The world has changed, though most people don't know it. Director Harrison's organization, which I learned is called the Threshold Protocol, has gone from a small, secretive group to a multinational effort. We have response teams on every continent monitoring sites, maintaining the harmonic barriers the old men taught us to create. It works mostly. The breaches have slowed but not stopped. I run the North American division now, coordinating from a command center hidden in a plain office building in Virginia. We have 100 personnel, most of them veterans of encounters like mine. Carter even came back. He said the nightmares were worse when he wasn't doing something about them. We don't talk about the old days much, but sometimes I catch him staring at nothing, and I know he's thinking about that night when reality broke. Dr. Whitaker heads our research division. She's made remarkable progress understanding the science behind what the old men did naturally. It's about resonance, she explained to a room full of skeptical physicists. These entities exist in a state of quantum flux. The right frequencies can strengthen the boundaries between their dimension and ours, making it harder for them to cross through. The physics is beyond me, but I understand the practical applications. We've installed hidden harmonic generators in major cities, disguised as cell towers or art installations. They run constantly, maintaining a subtle frequency that most people can't even hear but which keeps the boundaries stable. Power consumption is massive. We're secretly responsible for about 2% of North America's energy usage, but it's a small price to pay. Still, we're fighting a losing battle. The generators are a temporary fix, not a solution. They can prevent minor breaches, but against a major incursion like what we saw at Checkpoint Delta, they'd be overwhelmed in minutes. We need the old men, or beings like them, living creatures who can instinctively maintain the barriers through their very presence. That's why I was in Tibet last month, following rumors of the Yeti. Not to prove they exist, we know they do, but to find them before it's too late. The local monastery had records going back centuries describing the mountain singers who kept the valley safe. But when we reached the described locations, we found only abandoned caves and old footprints. They'd moved on or died out or perhaps crossed over like the ones at Mount Rainier. The Himalayas feel different now, unstable. The monks know it too. They've increased their chanting, their prayers, trying to fill the gap left by the old men's absence. Sometimes I think it helps. Other times, I hear reports of climbers disappearing on Everest, their bodies never found, and I wonder what's stirring in the deep places. Last week, something new happened. We detected a breach forming in downtown Chicago, right beneath the Willis Tower, a major population center. No way to evacuate without causing panic. We activated every harmonic generator in the city, but the readings kept climbing. I was preparing to authorize what Harrison calls Protocol 7, a controlled explosive collapse to seal the breach, when the readings suddenly stabilized. Security footage showed something impossible. A child, maybe 10 years old, standing in the tower's basement, humming. The sound was picked up by our sensors, a perfect recreation of the old men's harmonic patterns, but coming from a human throat. The breach sealed itself within minutes. We found the child an hour later, confused and scared, with no memory of going to the basement. Her name was Maria Santos, and according to her parents, she'd been having dreams. Dreams of tall, hairy figures teaching her songs. Dreams that started 3 months ago, right around the time the last old man walked into the breach at Mount Rainier. She wasn't the only one. We've documented 17 cases worldwide of children spontaneously producing the harmonic frequencies. All of them report similar dreams. All of them are between 8 and 12 years old. Dr. Whitaker thinks it's evolution, humanity developing a defense mechanism against an existential threat. Harrison thinks it's something else, something the old men did in their final moments, passing their knowledge to the next generation of guardians. I think about Walker sometimes. We never found his body, but last year a park ranger in West Virginia reported strange incidents. Campers claiming to hear someone in the woods knocking on trees in specific patterns, footprints that looked human but were too large, and just once, a blurry photograph of a figure standing at the edge of a campfire's light, tall, covered in what might be fur or might be shadows, watching. The rangers said local kids have started calling it the knock-knock man. They say if you hear the knocking, you should knock back 3 times, and he'll keep you safe from the things that come up from below. It's probably just a story, folklore growing around half-remembered truth. But sometimes, when I'm reviewing breach probability maps and see that West Virginia has remained remarkably stable, I wonder. The children we found, the ones who can sing the frequencies, we're training them not as soldiers but as musicians, teaching them to strengthen and refine their abilities. Maria is our star student. She can now maintain a barrier for over an hour, and she's teaching the others. They treat it like a game, unaware that they're preparing to inherit a war that's been raging since before humanity existed. But there are ethical concerns. These are children, and we're asking them to stand between our world and something that shouldn't exist. Dr. Whitaker argues it's no different from teaching them to swim to prevent drowning, a necessary survival skill for the world we now inhabit. Harrison just sees assets, resources to be used. I see kids who remind me of Walker on his first day, eager, unaware of what they're really facing. The breaches are evolving, too. The entities aren't just trying to push through anymore. They're testing our defenses, looking for weaknesses. Last month, one managed to partially appear in a shopping mall in Tokyo. The cameras caught it for just 3 seconds, a mass of impossible angles and writhing darkness, before our Tokyo team's generators forced it back. 37 people saw it. Most are still in psychiatric care. We're developing new protocols. Every major construction project now secretly includes harmonic resonators in the foundation. We've infiltrated architectural firms, ensuring that buildings are designed to naturally amplify the protective frequencies. It's not enough, but it's something. Dr. Whitaker believes we have maybe 10 years before the barriers fail completely. 10 years to either find a permanent solution or prepare humanity for a reality where the laws of physics are more like suggestions, where solid ground can become permeable, where things from other dimensions walk freely through our world. I've started having dreams myself, not of the old men, but of that mountain, that night, of the ancient one who spoke to me. In the dreams, it's trying to tell me something important, something I need to understand. But I always wake up just before the message becomes clear, left with only a feeling of urgency and the faint echo of that otherworldly harmony. Yesterday, Maria asked me a question that I couldn't answer. "Mr. Price," she said, her young face serious, "what happens if we're not strong enough? What if there are more of them than there are of us?" I told her we'd find a way, that humanity always does. But the truth is, I don't know. The old men of the mountain held the line for thousands of years, and they're gone. Now it's our turn. And we're children playing with forces we barely understand. But we have something the old men didn't have. Technology, global communication, the ability to share knowledge instantly across the planet. And we have the children, the next generation, who seem to instinctively understand what took us years to barely grasp. Maybe that will be enough. Or maybe, somewhere in the deep forests or remote mountains, some of the old men survived. Maybe they're watching, waiting to see if humanity is ready to take up the burden they carried for so long. I like to think that's true, that we're not alone in this fight. Because if we are alone, if it's just us against what's trying to break through from below, then Maria's question becomes prophecy. What happens when we're not strong enough? I think about that ancient old man placing his hand on my shoulder, saying, "Now you know." But knowledge and ability are different things. We know what we're facing. We know what needs to be done. Whether we can actually do it remains to be seen. The mountains are quiet now, but it's not a peaceful quiet. It's the silence of a held breath, of a wave pulling back before it crashes down. The old men of the mountain are gone, but their warning echoes still. Do not wake them. We woke them anyway, and now we must learn to sing them back to sleep or watch our world dissolve into chaos and impossibility. The children are practicing their harmonies in the next room. Through the wall, I can hear Maria leading them, her young voice strong and clear. It sounds almost like the old men's songs. Almost, but not quite. It's a human interpretation of something beyond human, a translation of a language we were never meant to speak. But it's what we have. It's our inheritance from the old men of the mountain, our only defense against the dark. And so we sing and we watch and we wait because they're still down there.